Greetings, students. So today we are going to begin looking at the process of photosynthesis, and I had to post this picture. I just think it kind of captures the feeling that I think many students have at this point. So know that cellular respiration is complicated, but you'll get there, children. You'll get there, I promise. So let's take a look at photosynthesis. We already kind of talked about the flow of energy through ecosystems and how much depends upon the sun, right? So for most ecosystems on Earth, the sun shines down and plants capture that energy. Once the plants capture that energy, they use it to make sugars, and then animals eat those sugars and then use it to get their own energy through cellular respiration. And in this previous screencast, we looked in great detail at how those animals do cellular respiration to get ATP out of those sugars. And then the fox, same way, eats the rabbit, gets sugars, fats, proteins, and does cellular respiration. So we looked at that in a lot of detail, and also at the cellular level, how the mitochondria and chloroplasts are these key organelles. So hopefully you have a fairly good understanding of cellular respiration now, and that understanding will serve you well in looking at photosynthesis because there are some similarities, and so understanding one does help you understand the other. So here's the equation for photosynthesis, and if you take a look at it, if we balanced it, it would be 6 CO2 plus 6 water yields glucose plus 6 oxygen. You might notice that this is the exact reversal of the equation for cellular respiration. These processes are opposite of each other. And we see that here, right? Cellular respiration takes in glucose and oxygen and gives off CO2 and water. The chloroplast takes in the CO2 and water, uses sunlight to make oxygen and glucose, right? So they're kind of reverse of each other. The next question is photosynthesis exert or endergonic? Well, light energy is going into the system, so that should tell you it is, did you get it? Endergonic, and has a positive delta G. And so if that's true, what do we need so that the reaction can occur? What we need is energy, and that energy comes from the sun's light. And what do we need so that the reaction will occur? We need enzymes, and those are bouncing around in the chloroplast. So let's take a look at light energy and then get into the details of how photosynthesis takes place. So light is obviously key to photosynthesis, so it's worthwhile reviewing some things about light that I think you learned in physics, perhaps in middle school. So the electromagnetic spectrum simply refers to the vast range of wavelengths of light. And it goes from the very, and each type of light is characterized by a specific wavelength, symbolized by that symbol lambda. And the wavelength is simply the distance between two peaks or two troughs. And it's measured in nanometers, which is 1 × 10⁻⁹ meters. And so you can see radio and TV waves have very long wavelengths, while X-rays and gamma rays have very short wavelengths. There's a certain set of wavelengths that are very special to humans, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, and that's because those wavelengths are what our eyes are actually able to detect. So we can see those wavelengths, which is pretty cool. Interestingly, other animals have different wavelengths that they can see. Insects, for example, many insects can actually see ultraviolet light that is invisible to us, which is kind of cool. So wavelength is just the way of characterizing the amount of the distance between these two peaks, and it correlates to energy. Shorter wavelengths have more energy, longer wavelengths have less energy. And I think just looking at that picture, if you look at these gamma rays, you could imagine, you know, if you were on a beach and the waves were coming at you that way, you know, that's high energy. Whereas if you're on that same beach and it's coming at you more from the radio and TV wavelength, it's a much slower boom, boom wavelength. So I think the energy is sort of intuitive if you understand what wavelength is. It should also be intuitive just based on your own experience. So radio waves, long or short wavelengths, high or low energy. Well, if you look at that diagram, hopefully you say there's a long wavelength, which means low energy. And that's a good thing because we are being bombarded constantly by radio and TV waves. We know this because if you turn on your radio, sound comes out. So that radio is picking up these wavelengths and playing it. And that's no big deal that these wavelengths are passing through our bodies constantly because they have such low energy. In contrast, an X-ray, wavelength, long or short, high or low energy. Well, if you look at that diagram, X-rays are right here, and they have a short wavelength, which means they have a high energy. And if you've ever gone to get an X-ray taken, you'll note that the little tech person who's taking the X-ray, they like position you. They then put a lead shield over a lot of your body to protect you from that X-ray. They then go into this little extra room and they sort of hide and they dink, push the button, and you can even hear the little beep. Dink. That's it. It's just a little dink. That is the length of time that you were exposed to an X-ray. And yet that tiny little bit of exposure is high enough risk that you wear the lead shield and they hide in the room because it has high energy. And people who, first studied X-rays, many of them ended up dying of cancer because X-rays can actually damage your cells and cause cancer. So, huge difference between how we treat X-rays versus radio waves, and it all comes down to that wavelength and how much energy they are. In the middle of those two extremes is ultraviolet light. Ultraviolet is right here. So, kind of intermediate. And again, enough energy to cause sunburn and damage your skin, but not quite enough to be as deadly as X-rays, though certainly too much sun exposure can be contributed to or can attribute to skin cancer. So kind of in the middle, right? So these things should make sense. Infrared light, by the way, is right about here. And that's basically heat, and heat again is harmless to us generally, and lower wavelength, no, longer wavelength, lower energy. Okay. How is it that light interacts with matter? Well, light can interact with matter in several ways. One, it can be transmitted. And so you're familiar with, I don't know if you've ever seen a device known as a window, but a window is simply a glass pane that light passes right through. So it can be transmitted. Light can be reflected. So a mirror, right? Interestingly, if you see green, what that means is green is the color that is not absorbed. So a green leaf on a plant will not absorb green light. The green light bounces off, and that's why the plant appears green. And all the other colors are actually absorbed by that plant. Light can also be absorbed by matter. And this is the one we're really going to be focusing on. When it's absorbed, the matter essentially captures that energy, the light energy, and converts it into some sort of internal energy. And we'll look at that in a moment. And the color we see is generally the opposite of what is absorbed. So again, if green is what we see, then we're going to probably be absorbing a lot in the red, orange, purple frequencies, though really all of these are going to be absorbed to some extent. So white, turns out, substances reflect all wavelengths, and black absorbs all wavelengths. And that is why if you wear black on a hot sunny day, you tend to get hot, whereas if you wear white, you tend to be a little bit cooler. So I kind of gave this answer away. Plants, because they're green, are reflecting green light, but absorbing all those other wavelengths. And so we can actually measure this with something called an absorption spectrum. And an absorption spectrum is a graph of light absorption versus wavelength for a different molecule. And lo and behold, we see green, we absorb very little light, but we do absorb the oranges, reds, and the purples, blues, etc. And so, this diagram is maybe a little cleaner. You can kind of see. So green is not going to be a very effective wavelength for getting plants to absorb it. So what molecules are actually responsible for absorbing that light? The molecules are pigments. And you've heard of some pigments. I'm guessing you've heard of chlorophyll. Beta carotene is one, maybe you've heard of that absorbs. And you can actually, there's a lab where you can like separate these pigments and they have different colors. And that makes sense that they would be different colors because that means they're going to absorb different wavelengths of light. So by having a wide variety of pigments, a plant can absorb a wide variety of light. Interesting fun fact, in the fall, the leaves change color. Why is that? Well, the reason why is plants begin to break down chlorophyll. And that's because they're going to dump their leaves for the winter. The leaves are going to radiate too much heat off, and if they keep those leaves, they're going to get too cold and they're going to die. So they dump the leaves. But before they dump the leaves, they break down the chlorophyll. And the reason they do that is because chlorophyll has these nitrogen atoms. It turns out that nitrogen is pretty hard to come by for plants. And so they get it from the soil. Farmers add nitrogen to their soil to help plants grow better. And so the plant doesn't want to lose that nitrogen, so it breaks the chlorophyll down. And when it breaks that green chlorophyll down, then that reveals these other pigments that have been there all along. So the yellows and the reds and the oranges start to appear because they're no longer dominated by the greens. The other pigments, they don't really need to worry about breaking these down as much because it's just carbon and hydrogen. And as we're going to see, they get carbon from photosynthesis, and so it's just not as important to keep those carbons. So what happens when a pigment absorbs light? Well, basically it goes back to chemistry. A specific wavelength of light is used to move an electron to a higher energy level within an atom. So basically you've got an electron in an energy level. When a specific wavelength of light hits it, woohoo, it jumps up to a higher energy level. That is what is happening when it absorbs light. You probably remember this lab in chemistry where you maybe dipped Q-tips in different salts and lit them on fire. This is what you were studying in that unit in chemistry. By lighting them on fire, you were basically getting those electrons to go woohoo to the higher energy level. And then immediately after being excited, then it would fall back down to its original energy level. Wah! And when it gives off that or drops down to a lower energy level, it gives off a specific wavelength of light. So basically in chemistry, you're going woohoo, 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 as it absorbs light from the flame and gives off light. As it absorbs energy from the flame and gives off that specific wavelength of light. And different atoms have different energy configurations and therefore give off different colors. Now, we're going to pause there, but in a little foreshadowing here, in photosynthesis, what happens is when that electron gets excited, woohoo, to that higher energy level, we don't let it fall back down. We go woohoo, and then we keep it in that high energy position so that we can use that to produce energy. More on that in our next screencast.